The death car. You probably know that there are very few bargains to be had nowadays. Paul and Marion Fowler had certainly never expected to find one while looking for a used car. They didn't have much money to spend, and looking for a good, cheap used car can be a pretty discouraging experience. As soon as they told a salesman how much, really how little, they could afford, they were immediately ushered to the back of the lot and left to wander among the heaps and wrecks that were in their price range. Most of these sad remains of automobiles looked as if they might actually have to be towed off the lot. The experience was particularly discouraging for Paul, because he was a real car buff. His old car, which he had nursed along for years, had finally and forever given up the ghost. A new baby and a low-paying job made anything but a cheap second-hand car out of the question. But Paul hadn't fully realized how much car prices had risen and how little his money would buy until he and Marion began looking. They couldn't wait forever either, because they really needed a car. Paul had just about decided he was going to settle for the next car that he could afford. Forget looks, forget comfort, forget gas mileage. They needed a car. They stopped at a large used car dealer on the other side of town. The salesman approached them with a big grin on his face. Used car salesmen always grinned at Paul until he told them how much he could spend. Paul told the salesman, but this salesman never lost his grin. "How about that car?" said the salesman, pointing toward a gleaming, deep maroon Mercedes. Paul glared at the salesman. This must be some sort of joke, he thought. All right, I suppose it hasn't got an engine, and next thing you'll tell me is that it makes a terrific planter. Engine's perfect. The salesman grinned. Paul and Marion circled the Mercedes cautiously, as though it might fall to pieces if they so much as touched it. Marion gasped when she looked at the price posted on the windshield, $500. That was even less than they had expected to pay. There must be a catch, Paul whispered to her. There has to be. I'll bet he won't let me drive it. Can I give it a test drive? Asked Paul. Sure, said the salesman, and dangled a set of keys in front of his face. Take it out for an hour, if you like. Mechanically, it's perfect. The Mercedes drove like a dream. Even in his wildest fantasies, Paul had never expected to be driving anything like it. Marion was practically purring with delight. She could imagine the faces of her neighbors when she drove up in a Mercedes. Angela Morton would choke with envy. Oh, let's get it, she said. Paul was still suspicious. His life had not been marked by good luck, and he wasn't used to it. There has to be a catch, he said over and over. There must be something terribly wrong with this car. He pulled the car over to a side street and opened the hood. He examined the engine thoroughly. Then, he crawled under the car. He did everything but take it apart. And he finally conceded that mechanically and structurally the car was perfect, just like new. It's probably a come-on, Paul said as they drove back toward the used car lot. When we get there they'll tell us they made a mistake and the car really costs $15,000. At first he had been wary of buying the Mercedes, and now he knew he would be deeply disappointed if he couldn't get it. As for Marion, she had fallen in love with the sleek maroon machine and would be crushed if the deal fell through. The salesman was waiting for them, still grinning. Drive's okay, said Paul, trying to sound nonchalant, as though he could take it or leave it. How much did you say it was? $500, replied the salesman, beaming. Slowly, trying not to betray his eagerness, Paul reached for his checkbook, and the deal was completed in a matter of minutes. It was hard to say exactly when the trouble began. For a few days Paul and Marion basked in the glow of admiration and envy from their neighbors. The remarks about poor gas mileage and the difficulty of getting parts for foreign cars were brushed aside as sour grapes, which they were. Everybody in the neighborhood wanted a ride in the car, and Paul and Marion doled out the privilege, like monarchs distributing coins to the poor. Marion was faintly, almost subconsciously, aware of a strange odor in the car the first time she took it out alone. By the third time she drove alone, the odor could no longer be ignored. The odor was rather hard to describe. It smelled sort of like a piece of meat that had gone bad, but not quite. Marion checked over the inside of the car carefully to see if something had been left to rot, but no, the car was clean. No one else seemed to notice the odor. In fact, when she was out in the car with Paul or with someone else, there was no smell. But when she drove alone, there it was, and it was getting worse. It became so bad that she practically could not get in the car alone, and she avoided driving by herself. The smell seemed to permeate the entire car, but it was strongest in the trunk. When Marion opened the trunk, the stench was so overpowering that she gagged and almost threw up. While trying to describe the odor to herself, she hit on the phrase, the odor of death. That's what it seemed to be, the odor of death. Marion didn't talk about the odor with anyone, not even Paul, since no one else seemed aware of it. That worried Marion terribly. Perhaps there was no smell, perhaps she was going crazy. Perhaps she had a brain tumor. Marion had read somewhere that people with brain tumors sometimes smelled things that weren't there. She had become so wrapped up in her own fears and worries that she failed to notice that Paul too had been avoiding the car, and that for days on end it just sat at the curb. Finally one night Marion broke down and confided all her experiences and fears to her husband. Instead of looking worried, Paul looked immensely relieved. "So it's happened to you too," he said. "Every time I get in the car alone, the smell chokes me. I was afraid to tell anyone." The car had to go back, there was no doubt about that. The very next day Paul and Marion, together so that they did not have to put up with the horrible smell, drove the car back to the lot where they had purchased it. The same salesman was there. He was no longer grinning, but he didn't look surprised either. "So you've brought it back. I knew you would. They all bring it back. They can't stand the smell." Only then did the salesman reveal the Mercedes' violent history. The car had belonged to a man who police said was an important member of an organized crime family. One day the man went for a drive and disappeared. His car was discovered 4 weeks later parked at the airport. The man, or rather his corpse, had been locked in the trunk. He had probably been killed shortly after he disappeared, and his body was left in the trunk. It was July, and a hot July at that. In fact, it was the smell that first brought the car to the attention of the police. The body was badly decayed by the time it was found. The Mercedes itself was sold at a police auction. It was in perfect shape, aside from the smell of the rotting corpse which seemed to cling to it. But after a good thorough cleaning, even that was washed out. The trouble was that every time someone bought the car, the smell seemed to return, but only when a person was driving alone. The car was cleaned repeatedly, but the same thing continued to happen. No matter how low the price, no one would ever keep the car for more than a few weeks. Album cover. Sarah was walking home as fast as she could. She had a biology test tomorrow, and she didn't want to fail. As she walked faster and faster, her long blonde hair flipped in the wind. She was coming up to her street when she saw a beautiful old record player. She went over to it and started to check it out. It was a shiny red color with light brown timber edges. There was a record with it. On the cover of the record was a picture of a pretty little girl. Next to the girl was "Do Not Play," scratched into the black background. The record player was light enough for her to carry, so she decided to take it home with her. Her parents were out for the next couple of days, so as soon as Sarah got home, she went straight to her room and started to figure out how to work the record player. About an hour after getting home, Sarah found out how to turn the record player on. As soon as she turned it on, beautiful old-style music started playing. Sarah completely forgot about her biology test and started dancing along. In the middle of dancing, the record player stopped. There was a high-pitched screaming sound and then a pause. The pause went on for 5 seconds, then there was another screaming sound and the music started again. Being a bit scared, Sarah turned the record player off and went to do her work. At 10 o'clock that night, the record player turned on. Sarah awoke from her lovely dream and listened. The music was so beautiful. It made her head sway to the rhythm. The music stopped. There was a screaming sound, then a pause. Sarah's head stopped swaying. She was as stiff as a rock. Peek-a-boo. I see you. I am in your town. Instead of the lovely music, there was a little girl singing. Her voice was so delicate, but her words were terrifying. There was another scream, and the record player turned off. The next night, the same thing happened. There was the scream, the pause, but the singing was different. The little girl sang, "Peek-a-boo. I see you. I am in your street." There was another scream, then nothing. Sarah was terrified of what just happened. She hid under the covers and refused to make any noise. The very next night, the record player turned on. A scream, a pause, and a little girl singing delicate but terrifying words. "Peek-a-boo. I see you. I am in your house." She nearly had a heart attack. Sarah froze on the spot and didn't move at all. Just when Sarah started to fall asleep, she heard footsteps coming up to her room. A minute later, the footsteps reached her door. There was a long pause, then a creaking sound. She moved her head slowly out from the covers and saw the door opening. There was a small black figure in the hallway. Sarah didn't know what was happening. Her head was spinning so fast. There were a couple of footsteps, and then the face of a little girl appeared. She started to sing, "Peek-a-boo. I see you." As she sung, she raised her hands above her head. The glint of a knife shone in the darkness. "Peek-a-boo. You see me. Goodbye, Sarah." When her parents got home, they went to check in on Sarah. When they walked in, they were horrified. There was Sarah laying on the bed, dead, holding the cover of the record. Sarah's throat had been slit and there was blood all over her dressing gown. The record player was playing "Peek-a-boo" over and over and over again. When the terrified parents looked at the cover of the record, the picture of the little girl moved. The little girl screamed, "She shouldn't have played it." They dropped the cover of the record in shock. Sarah's parents backed out of the room slowly, not being able to look away from their daughter's body. As they moved further away, they could hear a little girl singing, "Peek-a-boo. I see you." Slowly faded as the last of Sarah's spirit vanished into the record cover. A week later, a young couple were walking down the street when they came across a beautiful red record player sitting on the curb. The young woman insisted they take it. The couple took the record player to their small apartment. Little did they know, as they were walking, the little girl on the record was giggling as Sarah was screaming for them to stop. Dead Man's Inn. In September 30, 1980, a dilapidated inn burned to the ground in Tiszakört, Hungary. Although the fire was intentional, no one cared to find the unknown arsonist. The simmering timbers were all that remained of a haunted building that had been a haven of horror for 60 years. One unfortunate guest described a spine-chilling sight while staying at the inn. The German tourist was frightened senseless one evening when he opened the dining room door. He saw a large table surrounded by 10 rotting corpses, each holding a glass of wine. They were wearing ragged clothes from the 20s and their lips were curled back, revealing a hideous grin. Then everyone at the table slowly turned to face him and raised their glasses in a toast to the dead. The terrified man ran away and never looked back. The citizens of Tiszakört knew what had happened and were relieved to see the haunted house finally destroyed. Perhaps the evil inn's grisly legend had also perished in the smoldering ashes. It all began in 1919 when Lazio Kronberg and his wife Susie faced a bleak future after spending all their savings to keep the inn open. Poverty was just another direful circumstance they would have to accept after suffering several other tragedies. Their youngest son and daughter had run away from home years ago, and 2 older boys had died during the recent war. There was only one way to escape bankruptcy. The desperate innkeepers decided to pursue a new venture that would satisfy their creditors. Although apprehensive about resorting to crime for survival, they thought it was the only solution, and so, bought bags of quicklime and poison. Lazio told curious guests the quicklime was going to be used for a new outhouse, while Susie explained that the strychnine would eliminate pesky rats. Lazio filled a large trench with quicklime, but the offensive rodents never dined on strychnine soup. The poison was added to glasses of wine and served to the Kronbergs' guests during dinner. The victims' valuables were then removed before the bodies were tossed into the trench. Local authorities estimated that 10 unfortunate customers enjoyed their last glass of wine at the inn before the summer of 1922. The last candidate for the quicklime trench signed the inn's register on August 14, 1922. "Just call me lucky," said the jovial salesman in his 30s. "I've been very successful and now I'm searching for investment property. In fact, I'm thinking about settling here in Tisakurt." After dinner, Lazio had an unusual feeling about Lucky and did not want to harm him. But Susie objected furiously. She had been eyeing the new guest's heavy suitcase and was sure it contained money or jewels. They served Lucky the strychnine sherry and waited impatiently for him to collapse. Susie's suspicions proved true, and Lazio was thrilled to find the suitcase filled with gold. He also found a faded photograph at the bottom of the bag. Lazio and Susie studied the photo and soon recognized it as a picture of the Kronberg family that was taken years ago. The two innkeepers were horrified to discover they had just killed their long-lost son, Nicholas, who ran away when he was 9 years old. He had become a prosperous salesman and told his friends he was going back home to surprise his parents with a gift of gold coins. He drank the fatal glass of wine before revealing his true identity. Lazio and Susie were found in the same position as diners who were seen by the German tourist. The murderous couple penned a complete confession before joining Nicholas at the table. They drank a glass of strychnine wine and were found by the villagers 3 days later. The inn was operated by several owners before and after World War II. Each proprietor admitted seeing the ghosts of Lazio, Susie, and the murdered guests who ate their last meal at the sinister inn. The ghastly visions were still being seen where so many came to spend the night and never checked out. Drip, drip, drip. This eerie encounter is said to have taken place around West Chazy in New York State. Not long ago, a local resident, deciding to go fishing in a nearby pond, dug himself some worms, cut himself a nice pole, and taking along his dog, clambered into an old flat-bottomed boat for a quiet afternoon. The dog curled up in the bottom of the boat and fell asleep almost as soon as the man had baited his hook and tossed it over. The fish weren't biting. The man rowed from one spot to another, trying first here and then there along the shore. It was almost as though all of the fish in the pond had been caught or were in hiding. Finally, the man decided to try his luck in the middle of the little lake, where the water was deepest. The moment he anchored there, the dog, who had been sound asleep the whole time so far, woke with a start and began to whine and tremble. The man spoke sharply to him, telling him to be quiet and lie down. The dog obeyed, but he kept whining softly and trembling violently. Hardly had the man dropped his hook to the bottom when he felt a tug. He began to pull on the line, but it seemed to hold fast to the bottom. At this point, the dog jumped to his feet and began to bark viciously, showing his teeth and peering over the side of the boat, rocking it sharply. While struggling with the line, the man gave the dog a blow with one of the oars, sending him into the other end of the boat, where he cringed, whimpering. Once more the man heaved his stout fishing pole. Slowly his catch, whatever it was, came to the surface. Tangled on the end of the line was a great clump of what looked like human hair. Shining in it was a bright golden barrette. As the object appeared at the side of the boat, the dog let out a howl of terror and plunged into the lake, heading for shore. He soon made it to land and vanished into the woods. The man was amazed at the actions of the dog, but nevertheless decided to take the hair home and give the barrette to his wife. She could use it, he thought, to hold her hair back. The barrette was so entangled that they would need to hang the hair before the fire to dry out to make removal easier. His wife, though horrified at the idea, coveted the bright barrette and so consented. Long after the strands of hair were dry, the sound of dripping could still be heard. It went on all evening. Then, at the stroke of 12, a woman's voice came from the hanging strands. It told of her murder and how her body could be recovered. Then the voice faded away and was heard no more. The man and his wife couldn't believe what they'd heard and decided to keep it to themselves for the time being, particularly so that the wife could keep the valuable barrette. However, the dripping sound continued. It went on all night and all the next day, and the day after that. Finally, they could stand it no longer and reported their find to the authorities. Police dredged the lake and recovered the body, which was identified by the golden barrette. The dog never returned. Haunted by a dove. Many years ago, in an Alabama village, there lived a man and his wife who were supremely happy together. After years of wedded bliss, the wife became very ill and nothing could be done to save her. On her deathbed, she announced to the family and servants that she would return to the garden in the form of a white dove so that she could be with her husband in the place where they had known such true love and happiness. Moments later, she died. Years passed, but no dove appeared to carry out the dying wife's promise. Eventually, the widower fell in love with another woman and decided to marry her and bring her to the big house to live. On the day he carried his new bride over the threshold and into the house, a white dove came fluttering into the garden and perched upon a flowering snowball bush by the gate. It uttered long, low moans as though it were heartbroken. Every afternoon the dove returned to moan and sigh on the snowball bush. The servants were frightened and upset. They thought that surely this meant that the first wife's promise was now being carried out. Eventually, the second wife heard the story, and she too became disturbed. Soon people from the village and from neighboring plantations came to stare over the garden wall at the dove on the snowball bush. The new wife grew nervous and ill-tempered, and the happy home began to crumble. Legend or no legend, the husband wanted to preserve his new life. Frantic, he decided upon drastic action. The next afternoon he seized his rifle and slipped from the house, stealthily working his way into the garden, where the dove sat moaning and sobbing. He raised his rifle and fired. A woman's scream answered the blast of the gun and the dove flew away, its breast reddened with blood. That night, as the husband slept, he died. No one could determine the cause. His widow moved away to escape the tragic memories, and the great house fell into ruins. The master of the house was buried by the snowball bush. His gravestone, they say, is still there, but there are no Veters but one. For it is said that every spring when the blossoms of the snowball bush first open, a white dove with a red splotched breast appears among them, moaning pitifully.